Hello everyone. Today there are many stories, some of which are truly frightening. I hope these stories from real people will touch you and ease your pain.
My grandmother was in intensive care in the hospital. She was already unconscious, she did not react to what was happening around her. And my little daughter, who was at home with me, was talking to her. She was looking specifically at one point, as if someone was standing there. Then she turned to me, and conveyed my grandmother's words. I would never have believed that this could happen. A 2-year-old child answered with adult phrases, told things about my childhood that only my grandmother and I knew. Described in details an apartment in which she had never been. And when my grandmother died, I was at home doing my own thing, and suddenly something in my soul seemed to break off, tears flowed like a hail. I sat down and burst into tears. I looked at the clock, it was 2 p.m., and an hour later my aunt called and said that at that time my grandmother died. My daughter never saw her grandmother again.
I was about 10 years old when I had this dream. I was standing in the yard holding my leg, looking in bewilderment at it, why it was in my hands. In the morning, I went out into the yard and told my neighbor about that dream. She said that someone would die, but not relatives. A day later she died.
My dad was paralyzed for about a year when my 23-year-old daughter got meningitis. I ran to the hospital every day, fed her and ran back. The neighbors said that my grandfather screamed when I was not at home, and then one time I ran home, and my father, who had hardly spoken, began to tell me his dream. A girl came to him, stroked his head, kissed him and laid down next to him. We even laughed. A little later they called me from the hospital and said that Anna, my daughter, died. And 2 days later, my grandfather died too.
My mother died 20 years ago. And 4 years ago I was staying overnight at my sister's. We were sitting in the evening watching TV. Suddenly we saw her little 4-year-old son playing with a ball and periodically throwing it to the side into the hallway. We asked him what he was doing, and the child answered, "My sister, I'm playing ball with your mother, she's standing there in the hallway." We were shocked. The child was little, my sister had never talked to him about his grandmother. It was surprising.
My father died in 2022. Before his death, he got pneumonia, not corona. We thought it was just a cold, in general, we didn't think it was so serious. So while he was laid with pneumonia at home, I dreamed of my uncle. They were friends with my dad. I dreamed that we were sitting in the room together, me, my dad and my uncle. Dad was telling me something. And I saw that my uncle was standing without shoes. I was surprised. Suddenly my uncle disappeared. And he left his shoes. I felt so uneasy, the dream was bad. I told my dad to get ready to go to the hospital as I had a bad dream. And Dad told me, "Give me my last cigarette." I thought why he told that it was last cigarette? Anyway, we brought him to the hospital. 3 days later he died. And the most interesting thing was that my mother had everything prepared for the funeral, clothes, but shoes were not bought. That's when you believed it. My uncle brought and gave him his shoes as my dad did not have shoes. I miss my dad so much and I wish he would come and let me know that he's doing well there. May the kingdom of heaven be yours, my dear Daddy.
My grandmother died in February, many years ago, and in April it was my father's birthday and we came to congratulate him. My grandmother lived with my parents till her death and our family was very close. We stayed up late, my husband and I had a long way to go, to the other end of the city, and we stayed the night at my parents'. At night I woke up from the sound of shuffling steps and the tapping of a cane. That's how my grandmother had been walking lately. I wasn't scared, I thought maybe someone was walking around at the neighbors'. In the morning I asked my parents, "Is there an old person living at the neighbors'?" It seems like there wasn't anyone. They looked at each other, and then said that they heard it every night, but not at the neighbors, but in our apartment that in August. It was 6 months after my grandmother died and on the same day we buried my father. After that, the sounds of footsteps stopped. My mother said that my grandmother had taken my father, she loved him very much as he was her firstborn. She took him because life there was better. Maybe so, but it was very hard without Dad. For a long time I hesitated to write my story, because it was too implausible. Now I have decided, so I am writing. My grandparents raised me, completely replacing my parents. My grandfather died first. My aunt took my grandmother to live together. I moved to another city. A few years later, I dreamed of my late grandfather. He knocked on the window and said that today he would take my grandmother. I cried a lot and asked him to take me. He replied that my grandmother was his wife and would cook for him. I cried for a long time and asked him to take me. I promised that I would do everything also. He replied, I will take you in 45 days, your aunt in several days later. Then he listed all the relatives who died, later one by one, just as he said. Only not it happened not in several days, but years. I asked him to let me say goodbye to my grandmother. He thought and said, okay, go, say goodbye, I'll pick her up on Tuesday at 6 a.m. It was Thursday. I went to say goodbye to my grandmother. Only my grandmother had a stroke that night. But she knew I had arrived. She stroked my hand with one finger. She died on Tuesday at 6 a.m. I figured he would pick me up at 70. Too bad it was too early. But now I know I'll be with them and I won't be so scared. Many years have passed since that dream. I've had prophetic dreams all my life before all the important events. Now I know everything in advance, but I can't change anything. I knew about the war in the Ukraine too.
This is our family story, the story of a real miracle. It was about 30 years ago. I am telling the story from my mother's words, since I was little and did not see or know all this. As a rule, little children are protected from such things. My sister was about 24 years old then, she had just gotten married. And then she got very sick, her throat hurt terribly. At first the doctors treated tonsillitis, and then they discovered cancer in the last stage. She was treated in the hospital, but nothing helped her, and it only got worse. At first she walked along the wall in the hospital, holding on to it. Then she could not even walk and fell ill. And on top of that, my poor sister also went blind. Her husband and mother came to her every day, taking turns. She no longer spoke, she could not, she no longer had the strength. But her husband came and read her a book, it calmed her down a little. She responded to that. And so the doctors told her mother and husband that they had done everything possible and impossible and that there was little time left for my sister. So that the relatives would be ready for her death. It was terrible, but her mother bought everything for the funeral. And then one day early in the morning the relatives received a call from the hospital that they should all immediately come to say goodbye. The closest relatives came and of course her husband and mother. Everyone went into the ward, she was alone, and everyone said goodbye. She was unconscious and did not respond anymore. The doctor said that everyone should leave. But her husband sharply replied that he would not leave and would be with her until the last second. He was in such a terrible state that the doctor did not argue with him. And when everyone came out, the husband grabbed her in his arms and started shaking her hard, and started screaming so loudly, crying, and begging, praying that she would come back. He began frantically asking God to help bring back his beloved. All the relatives, doctors, and nurses were in shock. His wild screams echoed throughout the hospital. I don't know how long he screamed and shook my sister. But suddenly, the sister, as if nothing had happened, opened her eyes and said, I was sleeping so deeply and had an interesting dream. The husband couldn't believe his eyes and ears, she hadn't spoken for a long time and had gone blind, and then she had such a clear and meaningful look and voice. And then she said that in the dream she saw an old man with a long beard and in white robes. And he repeated to her several times, for life, for life, for life. The husband screamed and the doctors came running, started examining her, testing her. She felt normal, as she hadn't felt for a long time. But of course she was weak. They examined her for several days, and no disease was found. The metastases disappeared, the tests were normal and she was discharged a few days later. At parting, The doctor said that it happened 1 in 1,000 cases and it is a miracle. Then my sister and her husband still went to the capital city so that they could examine her thoroughly in another hospital, to be completely sure that everything was normal. When she finally got to the doctor in the capital, he examined her, studied all the tests and analyses, and even got a little angry, saying that it was so difficult to get to him because of the queue. He confirmed that she was a healthy person and she took the place of some sick person. She and her husband told the whole story in detail. He couldn't believe it, because her throat was absolutely clean and she was absolutely healthy and there were no signs of illness. That was a miracle. I told as I remember, from my mother's words, and we have retold this story many times in our family. So, miracles happen in life, I know that for sure. And the main thing is that you always need to believe and hope.
My father had a bad heart and often had critical situations. But one day I came back from school, he told me something and I was horrified. My father was standing in front of me, talking and even joking, but he was gone. It was like a hologram in front of me. I didn't tell anyone anything, and he died that night. Several years passed. I was sitting at work, writing something. My coworker, who was leaving on a business trip that day, came up to me and asked me to pass on information to another coworker. I looked up, and, oh, horror. The man was gone, just a hologram? Horrified, I told my husband after work. He, of course, advised me not to fantasize. And at night, I was woken up by a phone call. They were calling from the traffic police, asking if I knew this man, since he and his wife had crashed to death on the highway at night, and my phone number was written down, for some reason, under the name important. After that, there was another similar incident. And after that, I ran to church. I prayed very much that God would not let me see anything like that again. Thank God, more than 30 years have passed. And it has not happened again. But I would really like to know what it was, and to tell others that the world is not as simple as we usually see it.
It is very difficult for me to write, it is very painful, but you have often read those stories when people have a premonition of their end. This is what happened to my daughter. To this day, 1.5 years has passed, I cannot forgive myself for not understanding it at that time. Not long before she passed away, my daughter began to feel, so to speak, depressed. She began to say that she did not see herself in the future. I tried to convince her that this was normal, that I did not see myself even in tomorrow, and she was still young, she was only 20 years old, that she would get married and would have children. But she categorically said that she would not get married and would not have children, although she loved children very much. We had such a conversation several times. Once, she was riding home from the city in a taxi, called me, all in tears. She said that she asked to stop the car, got out of the car and called me because she was scared. I was frightened that the taxi driver had offended her. She said that on the way, she suddenly saw herself from above, from the side, and was very scared. I calmed her down as best I could, and when she arrived, she was silent for a long time. Then she said again that she did not see her future and that the people around her were not real, like in some kind of game. We decided to see a psychologist. But since we live in a village, we couldn't make an appointment right away. And a few days later she was gone. This pain and guilt, that I didn't have time, didn't understand, that I couldn't help will be with me until the end of my days. We got to a psychologist, but she felt bad in the hallway of the hospital. They took her away by an ambulance but they couldn't save her.
My son, a couple of days before his tragic death, was a little strange, sad, indifferent, uncaring. He even did not appear on the film when I developed it. Everything was there, but the frames with him were empty. The neighbor had the same strange behavior. His wife couldn't understand what was happening to him. He said strange things, and then he died. How you can doubt that it's not that simple.
My friend has the same story. Only in her story her father got married, and her mother got married. Her dad told her about it in a dream. During her life, her mother dreamed of a man who was already deceased at that time and he proposed to her to marry him. She refused him. But he told her, "Nothing awful, in 8 years you will be mine." She died 8 years later.
My mother buried my stepfather. So a year later, he also said in a dream that he married another woman. Her names was so and so. And in spring we went to the cemetery. He really does have a neighbor with that name now.
I was really convinced that there is a check before death, by the example of my neighbor. He was a very good and kind person, and in the last month he had 2 small accidents, and all were not his fault. The first time the young man had 3 children, they left without claims, he simply felt sorry. The second time in the yard of the house a neighbor's girl hit his car with her car. She was worried and burst into tears, and he calmed her down, and again did not take a penny. His wife scolded him. And I told her, don't scold him, it's a check and it's true. He died soon because of heart attack.
I also want to share my stories, coincidences, I don't know what to call them. I know one thing, God exists. Or a higher intelligence. My mother was sick with cancer, stage 4. The surgeon who operated on her said she didn't have much time left. I was very upset, I cried endlessly. But in her ward, I supported her, smiled, saying, Mommy, we'll pull through. She believed me, my poor mommy. Now I'm writing, my heart is breaking. So, while she was in the hospital after the operation, I lived at her friend, because the hospital was in another city. And I started praying, asking God, please, let her live, at least a little longer. I read Psalm 90 many times a row. Right at 5 in the morning I started reading, from the heart, tearfully asking for God's help. And then one morning, a bird landed on the window from the street side. You see, it seemed like a hologram to me, it had a human face and huge wings. I was very scared, but I saw it all. It must have been an angel flying in. It scanned me inquisitively and disappeared. So, God gave my mother another year to live. I couldn't beg for more. I often remind this bird. Everything exists, God exists, angels exist. Don't sin, live according to your conscience.
A relative should not carry a coffin, especially a blood relative. My father-in-law died at the funeral. His son-in-law helped carry the coffin. A few days later, all the pictures fell off the walls in their apartment. The son-in-law and sister-in-law thought that grandfather was being naughty. Most likely, grandfather was warning about trouble. 4 months later, the son-in-law died too. By the way, he had previously carried the coffin of his mother and father, believing that all sorts of omens are superstitions.
In 2012, I went to the monastery. I was getting ready to write a note for health. I wanted to list my closest people: Lucas, Dominika, Nicolas, Berta. And then my gaze fell on a note thrown by someone, written for some reason in red pen. And there was written, Lucas, Dominika, Nicolas, Mikel. I was shaking. There can not be such coincidences. I held the note in my hand, and then put it back. It wasn't mine. Why should I take someone else's note? And soon it turned out that my mother Berta was terminally ill. And I had an advisor and assistant, a priest from another church. His name was Mikel. By the way, he didn't like my story. He said, no need for mysticism. And what was wrong? After all, it really happened, and it happened in a famous monastery.
When we were a young family, we got a room in a dormitory. A single mother lived in this room before us. She had a daughter, a baby, who died. When we moved in that room, my daughter was 2 years old. One day I sat her on the floor, gave some toys, blocks, and ran to the store for milk. It was nearby. I asked a neighbor to look after her. I got back, and the neighbor had bulging eyes. I asked, well, how was Monica behaving? The neighbor was scared. Your daughter was talking to someone. I said that there was no one in the room except her. I calmed her down, and watched the little one. She built such a big castle out of blocks and again talked to someone. She laughed, adding something of her own. I asked, who are you talking to? It is Hannah, there she is, watching a cartoon. Yes, I turned on a cartoon for her. It was like that for a long time. My husband and I started asking this neighbors, who lived there before us. So she told us that a baby had died, and her name was Hannah. We went to the church and ordered a memorial service for the repose of her soul. So my little one waited for that Hannah for a long time, saying that it was interesting with her. Everything passed, soon my Monica had a little sister. There was someone to play with.
That's all for today. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comment or a story and activate the notification bell not to miss our new videos. Bye bye.